Draco Malfoy and Astoria Greengrass. Of all the post-war love stories in the wizarding world, nobody saw Draco Malfoy's coming. The boy who spent 6 years making Harry Potter's life miserable, who wore the dark mark on his arm at 16, who nearly destroyed everything, ended up building something genuinely good, and then lost half of it in the most heartbreaking way. After the war, most people expected the entire Malfoy family to end up in Azkaban, and honestly, they probably deserved it. But Narcissa had already saved the entire wizarding world with one whispered lie in the Forbidden Forest, and Lucius provided the Ministry with detailed information on surviving Death Eaters in exchange for his freedom. Extremely on brand for a Malfoy. So, the Malfoys walked away, kept the manor, kept the fortune, and tried to figure out what came next. Draco Malfoy married Astoria Greengrass, younger sister of Daphne Greengrass, a pure-blood witch from a respectable wizarding family who had grown up surrounded by the same blood supremacy culture as Draco, and had rejected it completely. She brought that rejection directly into Malfoy Manor, which caused considerable tension with Lucius and Narcissa, particularly Lucius, who considered Astoria's attitude toward blood purity a personal insult. Together they had one son named Scorpius, and Draco made a deliberate and conscious decision to raise him differently. Kindness. Respect for Muggleborns. None of the ideology that had defined the Malfoy name for generations. It was a quiet but complete repudiation of everything his father had taught him, done not through grand speeches but through how he raised his child every single day. Then Astoria died young from a hereditary blood curse that had weakened her health throughout her life, leaving Draco to raise Scorpius alone in Malfoy Manor. The house that had once been Voldemort's headquarters, filled with dark artifacts and pure-blood portraits, became the place where a single father raised a kind, thoughtful boy who grew up to be nothing like the Malfoy legacy suggested he should be. Not a dramatic redemption, slower and messier than that, but real. Harry Potter and Ginny Weasley. The films did Ginny Weasley dirty, and that is simply a fact. In the book, she was never the quiet, supportive girlfriend waiting in the background. She was sharp, talented, and had completely gotten on with her own life by the time Harry finally noticed her. And yes, they did break up. Harry ended things at Dumbledore's funeral specifically because Voldemort would have used her against him, and he was not willing to put her in that position. Ginny understood. She waited anyway. By around 2002, they were married, making Harry a permanent member of the loudest, most chaotic family in Wizarding Britain, which she had basically been an honorary member of since he was 11. They had 3 children, James Sirius, the eldest, who inherited his grandfather's talent for mischief and made it his personal mission to cause maximum chaos at Hogwarts, named after Harry's father and godfather. Then Albus Severus, quiet and thoughtful, who became best friends with Scorpius Malfoy and was sorted into Slytherin, which required Harry to have a very honest conversation with himself about house prejudice. Named after 2 headmasters, one of whom Harry spent 6 years convinced he hated, and Lily Luna, the youngest, named after his mother and the friend who taught him that being different was never something to apologize for. Harry Potter, the boy who grew up in a cupboard with no family and no birthday cake, named every single one of his children after someone he had lost. If that doesn't get you, then nothing in the series will. Financially, the Potters were never struggling. Harry inherited his parents' Gringotts vault and the entire Black family fortune from Sirius. Ginny played professional Quidditch for the Holyhead Harpies, which in the wizarding world carries the same financial weight as the NBA here, before pivoting to journalism. The cupboard to castle pipeline, remarkable. George and Angelina Johnson. George Weasley lost Fred at the Battle of Hogwarts and then kept going anyway, which is either the bravest anyone did in the aftermath of that war, or the most heartbreaking, and the answer is probably both simultaneously. He married Angelina Johnson, a former Gryffindor Quidditch player and chaser who had previously dated Fred, which sounds complicated until you understand that grief and love rarely follow the rules people set out for them, and George and Angelina had both loved the same person and lost him in the same moment. They had 2 children together, a daughter named Roxanne and a son named Fred, because George was never going to let that name disappear quietly into history when he had the power to carry it forward. Fred II grew up with his uncle's name and his father's humor, which means the legacy continued in the most direct way George could manage. Weasley's Wizard Wheezies thrived after the war, expanding across the wizarding world and becoming one of the most successful businesses in Diagon Alley, to the eternal frustration of every teacher who kept finding joke products in their classrooms. George carried Fred forward not just in name but in every product, every joke, and every time someone laughed because of something he made. It cost him something every single day. He did it anyway. Neville Neville and Hannah Abbott. Not every post-war love story involved reforming governments or catching dark wizards. Some of them just involved a pub, a greenhouse, and two people who had earned a quiet life. After the war, Neville briefly joined the Auror office, realized his passion had always been herbology, and returned to Hogwarts as a professor under the woman who had once watched him melt 17 cauldrons in her classroom. McGonagall hired him anyway. That says everything about both of them. He married Hannah Abbott, a fellow Dumbledore's army member and former Hufflepuff, which the internet had not predicted because the films had spent considerable effort suggesting he would end up with Luna. He did not. Hannah eventually became the landlady of the Leaky Cauldron and later took over as Hogwarts matron when Madame Pomfrey retired in 2014, which meant that at some point Neville Longbottom and his wife were both working at Hogwarts simultaneously, while also running a pub. The logistics of that schedule alone deserve some kind of recognition. Neville was also named godfather to Albus Severus Potter, Harry's middle son, which means the boy who was once too frightened to stand up to his own friends ended up as a godfather, a professor, and the head of Gryffindor House. The Sorting Hat placed him in Gryffindor on day one. It absolutely always knew. Their life was quiet, grounded, and completely without drama. Luna, however, took a considerably different approach to settling down. Luna and Rolf Scamander. Luna Lovegood spent her Hogwarts years being dismissed as strange, dreamy, and slightly disconnected from reality by people who would later discover she was one of the most perceptive and genuinely original thinkers in the entire school. After the war, she became a magizoologist, traveled the world documenting magical creatures, and yes, she spent a meaningful amount of time searching for the crumple-horned Snorkack, a creature the rest of the wizarding world remained firmly convinced did not exist. She never found it. She found everything else though, discovering and classifying entirely new magical species that expanded wizarding knowledge in ways nobody else had thought to try. She married Rolf Scamander, grandson of Newt Scamander, the man who literally wrote the book on magical creatures. Luna Lovegood, the girl everyone quietly laughed at in the corridors, married into the most famous magizoologist family in wizarding history. The universe definitely has a sense of humor. They had twin sons named Lorcan and Lysander and raised them in the environment where being unconventional was not just accepted but actively encouraged, which honestly, given their parents, was never really in question. Luna waited until later in life to start her family, meaning her sons were younger than the children of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, which only added to the feeling that Luna had always been operating on her own schedule, completely unbothered by what anyone else was doing. Now, Ron and Hermione's story is just as solid, but considerably funnier. Ron and Hermione. Ron and Hermione might be the most debated couple in Harry Potter history. Half the fandom wanted Hermione with Harry. A surprisingly vocal portion wanted her with Draco, which is a whole separate conversation. Rowling herself admitted she sometimes wondered if she made the right call. But from the moment Ron looked at Hermione at the Yule Ball like someone had physically knocked the air out of him, it was always going to be them. 7 years of being completely obvious to everyone except each other. They just needed a war to finally do something about it. The wedding was exactly what you would expect. Hermione arrived prepared and composed. Ron got so drunk before the ceremony that his memory was mostly hazy, and when asked if he would take Hermione as his wife, reportedly responded with, "I think I do." Romantic. They had 2 children, Rose and Hugo Granger Weasley, both sorted into Gryffindor. Hermione made sure the children carried her last name alongside Ron's. She had spent years fighting for equality. She was not leaving her name out of her own family. Rose inherited Hermione's academic discipline, which Ron took enormous pride in pointing out at every opportunity. Hugo remained slightly less documented, which honestly might make him the most well-adjusted person in the entire family. Both parents took active roles in raising them, though their approach differed considerably. Ron constantly highlighted how Rose's intelligence clearly came from Hermione. Hermione focused on their education with the same terrifying dedication she brought to everything else. The children were presumably exhausted and also very well prepared for life. Shortly after the war, Hermione had restored her parents' memories in Australia, meaning Rose and Hugo grew up with devoted Muggle grandparents, which Ron found equal parts confusing and genuinely wonderful. Ron joined the Auror office briefly before leaving to help George run Weasley's Wizard Wheezies, which was honestly the right call for everyone involved. Hermione predictably went on to become Minister for Magic. Now, here's the detail that makes this relationship feel completely real. At some point after the war, Ron decided he wanted to learn to drive a Muggle car. A completely reasonable ambition, except for Ron being, well, Ron. He used a confundus charm to pass the driving test rather than actually learning the material. Hermione, the woman who had dismantled pure-blood discrimination laws and reformed the entire ministry, was reportedly furious about that specific thing. Not the dark wizard hunting, not the Horcrux camping trip, the driving license. Their relationship is one story. Ron's proudest moment, according to Rowling, was getting a chocolate frog card. Hermione is still processing that information. Percy and Audrey. Percy Weasley's redemption arc can be summarized in one sentence. He chose the ministry over his family for years. Watched the ministry collapse under a Dark Lord, showed up at the Battle of Hogwarts, cracked a joke, and his entire family forgave him on the spot. Turns out one well-timed joke did what years of apology letters probably could not. After the war, Percy rose to head of the Department of Magical Transportation under Kingsley Shacklebolt, which is exactly the steady, respectable, slightly unglamorous career Percy was always going to end up in, regardless of what happened around him. He married a witch named Audrey, about whom Rowling has revealed almost nothing publicly, which means Audrey either possessed the patience of an absolute saint or genuinely enjoyed listening to ministry transportation regulations discussed at dinner. Possibly both. They had 2 daughters named Molly and Lucy, and Percy rebuilt his family relationships quietly and without grand gestures, simply by showing up consistently, which for Percy Weasley was genuinely the harder thing to do. The mystery of Audrey is honestly one of the more entertaining loose ends in post-war wizarding history. She married into the most chaotic family in Britain, raised 2 daughters, and managed to avoid being documented in any meaningful way. Impressive work for someone married to Percy Weasley. Bill and Fleur. Bill and Fleur, meanwhile, had built the most stable and thoroughly documented home in the entire Weasley family, which given the competition was a considerable achievement. Bill Weasley survived a werewolf attack, married a part Vila French witch over his mother's initial reservations, fought in a war, and came out the other side looking completely unruffled, which suggests Bill Weasley is simply built differently from most people and has always known it. After the war, he and Fleur settled permanently at Shell Cottage and raised 3 children named Victoire, Dominique, and Louise, combining Weasley's stubbornness with Vila elegance in a household that was probably spectacular and chaotic in equal measure. Bill continued working as a curse breaker for Gringotts, occasionally traveling abroad but always returning home, while Fleur was decorated by the French Ministry of Magic for her wartime bravery and chose family life over any further public recognition. People had spent years underestimating Fleur Delacour because she was beautiful and French and therefore assumed to be decorative, conveniently forgetting that she had competed against dragons and merpeople in the Triwizard Tournament at 15. Post-war, she simply chose where her life was going and nobody stopped her. Their eldest daughter, Victoire, became the first member of the next generation to make Wizarding World headlines, though not for anything she did professionally. That particular story belongs to the boy who grew up surrounded by both the Potter and Weasley families, and somehow managed to make falling in love a public event witnessed by the most enthusiastic 11-year-old at the station, Remus and Tonks. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, who hated being called Nymphadora, and made absolutely sure everyone knew it, had one of the most quietly moving love stories in the entire series, and one of its most devastating endings. Remus spent years convinced he was too old, too poor, and too dangerous to be with anyone, a belief so deeply embedded that even after Tonks made her feelings completely clear, he spent the better part of a year talking himself out of accepting them. Tonks, who was funny and warm and entirely underrated by Remus's extensive list of reasons it would not work, simply waited him out. She was right, he eventually came around. They married, had a son named Teddy, and both died at the Battle of Hogwarts within what is believed to have been a short time of each other, leaving behind a baby boy who never got to know either of them. Teddy was raised by his grandmother, Andromeda Tonks, who had already lost her husband Ted during the war, and now raised her grandson alone with Harry as godfather, showing up throughout his childhood to make sure Teddy always knew who his parents were and how completely they had loved him. Remus and Tonks did not get the post-war story they deserved, but what they left behind was a boy who grew up loved, surrounded by families his parents had fought for, carrying their names forward into a world they helped save. Some stories end too early. That does not make them any less worth telling. telling. Teddy and Victoire. Teddy Lupin was orphaned at birth, inherited his mother Tonks's metamorphmagus abilities, meaning he could change his appearance entirely at will, and grew up so thoroughly embedded in the Potter and Weasley families that what happened next was honestly inevitable to anyone except apparently Teddy and Victoire themselves. Harry took his godfather responsibilities seriously from the beginning, showing up consistently throughout Teddy's childhood in a way that ensured he never felt the particular loneliness of growing up without parents, even if the absence was always there underneath everything. By his Hogwarts years, Teddy had developed a romantic interest in Victoire Weasley, Bill and Fleur's eldest daughter, and was reportedly changing his hair color to match her favorite shade, which is either the most romantic or most chaotic use of metamorphmagus abilities depending on your perspective. The relationship became public knowledge not through any announcement or quiet family conversation, but because James Sirius Potter, 11 years old and constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, spotted them kissing at platform 9 3/4 and immediately reported this information to absolutely everyone within hearing distance. James Potter inherited chaos from both sides of his family tree and deployed it without hesitation or apology. Teddy and Victoire's relationship linked the Lupin and Weasley families in the next generation in a way that Remus and Tonks, had they lived, would have found either completely wonderful or mildly overwhelming. Probably both. Hagrid and Madame Maxime. The films really pushed the romance between Rubeus Hagrid and Olympe Maxime, and honestly, it was easy to see why. Two half-giants, both warm and larger than life in every sense, thrown together during the Triwizard Tournament with an obvious mutual attraction and what appeared to be genuine chemistry. The films leaned into it, and audiences went along with it completely. The truth after the Deathly Hallows is considerably less cinematic. Rowling confirmed that the relationship between Hagrid and Madame Maxime did not last. Nobody knows exactly why, and Hagrid never really talked about it, which is on brand for a man who expresses everything through feelings and very little through words. Hagrid never married. His great loves were always Hogwarts, the creatures under his care, and the people he called family, even when they kept nearly getting themselves killed in ways that gave him genuine grief. He was still in his hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest in 2017, approaching 90 years old, still keeping creatures that had absolutely no business being near a school, and still inviting Harry's son Albus Potter to tea exactly the way he had done for Harry 3 decades earlier. Madame Maxime continued leading Beauxbatons with dignity and strength into the post-war era. They were not each other's ending, but for a brief moment during one very eventful school year, they were exactly what the other needed. And in the wizarding world, sometimes that is enough. And speaking of endings, here are all 24 major events you missed after the Deathly Hallows explained. That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Click now before Ron says, "I think I do," again.